quickly. Welcome everyone from the committee and other ACUS members and other interested people to come and join us and discuss this project on precedential decision making this afternoon. We really appreciate taking your time out of the busy week and especially on a Friday afternoon. I just want to briefly announce that unfortunately, ACUS's new chair, Andrew Floyce, was unable to attend this meeting because of another conflict. But he sends his best wishes and appreciation for all of our hard work and assures me that he will be here to discuss in person with everyone at our second meeting on November 4th. Beyond that, I will briefly take roll and then hand it over to Nadine, our chair, to take over the meeting. I'm going to call two rolls. The first roll will be the names of committee members and their alternates. After each name is called, please say here so we can make sure your mics are working. Nadine.
That was quick. Okay.
No. I was calling your roll.
Oh, I thought you were throwing it to me, man. I'm so lost. Okay, yeah, I'm here.
Jack Bierman.
Here.
Great. Adam Kress is alternate for Annika Cooper.
Here.
Great, welcome. Hi, Feldblum.
I'm here.
I'm sure I bangled up your first name.
No, you actually said it right. Hi.
How about that? Okay, Janice Hoffman and Renee Landers are both joining us a little bit late, but did either manage to sneak in early?
I'm
Nope.
here.
Oh,
Yep. This is Janice.
okay.
I'm here.
Great, welcome. Glad you could sneak out. Robert Lesnick.
Here.
Ray Lyman.
Hey, Matt, and it's Ray Limon.
Oh, I'm sorry, Limon.
No worries. Thanks.
Hi, Ray.
Jeffrey Lubbers.
Hey, Judge.
I'm here. Hi, Ray.
Hey there.
Okay. Is anybody from the Committee on Adjudication whose name I did not call here?
Who isn't a consultant?
Who isn't a consultant? Yes.
Rochelle Washington from the Departmental Appeals Board.
Great. Thanks, Rochelle. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Okay, the second roll will be the names of ACUS members who are not on the committee and their alternates. After each name is called, the person again should say here so that we know that your mics are working. First, I'll go with our consultants, Christopher Walker.
Here.
Melissa Wasserman.
Here.
Matthew Weiner.
Here.
Okay, and Bill Funk.
Here.
Jim Tozy.
Here.
And Lauren Alder-Reed.
Here. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. Are there any ACUS members not on the Committee on Adjudication who are here that I did not call? Okay, last thing is if anybody has any difficulty with technology during the course of the meeting, please reach out to me or Jordine via the chat function or email, and we'll be happy to help you out. With that, I'm going to hand it back to Nadine to take us off.
Great, thank you. It's good to see everybody. Thank you for joining us on a Friday afternoon. I know that might be the last thing you want to do on a Friday afternoon, or maybe it's the first thing. I don't know. So I'm going to run through the ground rules. Some of you know these already, but for those of you who don't, we're going to run through them anyhow. Only ACUS members or their designated alternates have full speaking privileges. So a non-ACUS member, if you want to speak, you need to write it in the chat or raise your hand. Please keep yourself on mute. And if you want to speak, again, use the chat feature or raise your hand using the Zoom function, and I will call on you. And then you can unmute, say your piece, and then mute again. I would like to ask that all ACUS members and their alternates use the webcam. It's always good to see faces, and it facilitates the discussion in a better way, I think. Unanimous consent is required for anyone other than ACUS members and their alternates to participate. I will consider calling on you, time permitting, at appropriate times. I will presume that there is consent, absent an objection.
Nadine is a senior fellow, a member or not?
You are.
Thank you.
Thanks for asking. I can read the list of those. If there's any, just raise a question if you have one like Judge Lesnick just did, but I think most of you know which category you're in. Again, if you want to speak and you're not an ACUS member or an alternate, you need to use the Zoom raise your hand function or the chat feature. Do not use the chat feature for anything other than indicating that you want to speak. It should not be used for back and forth discussion or substantive comments. I know there's a great instinct to do that, but I ask that you not do that. Save your comments for live discussion. Did I miss anything, Matt?
No, I think that's it.
Okay, great. So let's talk about our consultants before I turn it over to them. I just want to say, it's really great. We are in incredibly good hands for this project. I'm really excited to have these wonderful people involved. Matt, I'll start with you. You need no introduction, basically. For those of you who don't know Matt, he led the administrative conference as acting chairman for more years than I think he expected to, and was appointed as special counsel to the conference this past summer. He is also a committee member. Matt's teaching at Penn Law School and obviously still contributing to the work of the conference. And if you haven't seen it, I would recommend checking out a tribute written by our fellow committee member, Jack Bierman, last year honoring Matt. I commend you that, read that. Chris Walker, likewise very familiar to all of us. He is a fellow committee member, currently a law professor at the University of Michigan, formerly a law professor at Ohio State University. Chris teaches many subjects, researches many subjects, including administrative law. And with Matt, Chris co-authored the report that underlies recommendation 2020-3 on agency appellate systems, which features prominently in the report they've provided us today. Finally, last but not least, Melissa Wasserman. I look forward to getting to know you as well as I know Matt and Chris. Also a member of the committee. Melissa is currently a law professor at the University of Texas at Austin, formerly a law professor at the University of Illinois. She also researches and teaches many subjects, including administrative law. Melissa worked with Chris on an article in 2019, The New World of Agency Adjudication, and they studied in part the precedential decision-making primarily at the Patent Trade Trial and Appeal Board. This is one of the studies that helped lead to the creation of this project. So we have really great people on this, and I turn it over to whichever one of you is going to help us understand the report before we launch into the recommendation.
Well, Nadine, I think I've drawn the straw on this one. But if anyone, thank you. Initially, thank you for your very generous comments. This is actually my first meeting as a member of the committee, and I'm very glad to be part of the committee, even though I'm not allowed to vote today because I'm recusing myself, as is Chris and as are Chris and Melissa, who are also members of the committee because we're consultants and the ACUS bylaws require us to do so. In addition to thanking you, I do also want to thank, before on behalf of, I think I can do that on behalf of both Melissa and Matt, I want to thank Jeremy and Matt Gluth for helping with this project in innumerable ways, both on the sort of administrative side and the more substantive side as well. Thank you to both of them. This report is informed by long-standing conversations with both of them. Let me also thank all the agency officials who spoke with us. We were uniformly impressed by the quality of the insights that we received from the agency officials. So what I'd like to do is just offer a few brief, and I really do mean brief, observations on our findings. Then I'll just turn it over to, with Nadine's permission, turn it over to Chris and Melissa, just to see if they have any supplemental comments. And then most importantly, we'd certainly welcome comments and suggestions from the committee members. And of course, we strongly invite any members of the committee to offer us any written comments, or we could receive them orally as well after the meeting. We'd very much appreciate that. I know this is a very distinguished company and there's a lot of expertise in this virtual room today. So we do really welcome your comments. And I should say that, Jack, let me thank you not only for writing that tribute to me, but also for your comments on this project, which were excellent. You pointed out, among other things, that Allentown MAC, I think it's Allentown MAC versus NLRB, should be accounted for in the recommendations, and it should be accounted for in the report too, and we will certainly include that on the next draft of the report. So let me just offer, I think I have about 4 observations here before just asking Chris and Melissa if they have any supplemental thoughts. First, maybe we can just stipulate to a definition of precedent. The word precedent can be used in different ways. You could refer to something precedential as being an example or a guide. We use precedential decision-making in this report, as do at least the courts of appeals and all agencies, I think, or most agencies. We use we use the word precedential to refer to a decision that is legally binding in some manner or another. Of course, it can be overruled. And when we say binding, we're referring to binding on other adjudicators within the agency, either on sort of a vertical basis, or almost always on a vertical basis, but also sometimes on a horizontal basis when we're referring to, say, an appellate tribunal within an agency. So that's the first observation. The second observation is something that Chris might want to speak further to, but on the sort of conventional account of agency adjudication, that is the account that you see that you read about in law school case books, especially when you're talking about the Chenery 2 principle. Policy making is an important part of, or may be an important part of agency adjudication, or at least that agency adjudication is one of the policy making formats that an agency might employ. It was interesting, it struck us as interesting that nearly all of the interviewees, almost all of them adjudicators, did not characterize what they do as policy making, but rather see the task in which they're engaged as much more akin to what a judge does when deciding cases, which is, engaged in an interpretive exercise rather than a policy-making exercise. Chris may want to elaborate upon that, or maybe you have some questions on that, but let me leave it there for now. The third observation is most appellate systems use some form of precedential decision-making. There are 2 notable exceptions, and they're probably the 2 largest adjudication systems in terms of total case volumes. And that's the Board of Veterans Appeals, which actually has a regulation, a CFR codified regulation that says no decisions are precedential. And then the Social Security Administration Appeals Council, which, as we understand it, has regulatory authority to issue precedential decisions, but doesn't actually issue precedential decision, or at least hasn't done so in several decades, but rather SSA uses various forms of non-legislative rules. I'll just use the word guidance documents more generally to guide, constrain, and so forth, direct other decision makers. So that was an interesting finding that's reflected in the report. The fourth observation, and this is certainly reflected in the draft recommendations that we've put forth for the committee's consideration, is that we noticed a relative absence of rules on precedential decision making, and that includes rules addressing such fundamental matters as whether decisions of the agencies are precedential at all. And with respect to what we sometimes refer to as 2-tier systems, that is, appellate systems that designate some decisions as precedential and others not as precedential, Most of the agencies do not have rules, let alone CFR codified rules of practice that set forth the criteria for designating decisions as precedential or non-precedential. Now, there are some important exceptions here that might even be thought of as exemplars. So the Board of Immigration Appeals, or EOIR, the EOIR system, there are specific rules in place. There is a rule in place that actually sets forth the criteria for designating decisions as precedential, but that is not the norm. And that's in that respect, the agencies are situated quite differently, I think, than the U.S. Courts of Appeals, which most of which do have rules that draw the distinction. And many of which actually set forth the criteria for distinguishing between precedential and non-precedential decisions. And I know if they don't do it in rules, they at least do it in their case law. So those are my 4 observations. And before receiving, with Nadine's permission, any questions or comments that the committee members have, let me just turn it over to Chris and Melissa to see if they have any additional observations that they might wish to offer.
Yes, please chime in.
Melissa, do you have anything or?
No, I don't think I have anything to add. Chris, do you?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I'd add, we can talk more about the policymaking if folks are interested. I would just say, from having done all these interviews, which was super fun. I mean, these folks are just, they're just fun. They're all thinking about this issue. They've been thinking about precedential decision making for a long time. They don't talk with each other that much, and there's just so much variety among agencies. And so I hope that this report, this study, and this recommendation encourages agencies to take a look at how other agencies are doing it, because I was just surprised with how different each agency not only structures it procedurally, but why they're even doing it in the first place. The motivations for presidential decision making just really vary among agencies. So I'm hoping this project really encourages that kind of cross-agency collaboration and study.
Nadine, may I just offer one additional comment that I had neglected? No doubt there are some errors in the report, and we will go to the agency officials whose agencies are addressed in the report, just to ensure that we haven't gotten anything too wrong or the details wrong. I think we're pretty confident that overall that any errors are not of such a magnitude as to call into question any of our general findings or recommendations. But we will go to the agencies to ensure that we've got things right and things are generally characterized in a way that's satisfactory to the agencies.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Matt and Chris and Melissa. So are there any general comments before we dive into the recommendation about the report, or questions about the report in general? Jeff?
Yeah, and not surprisingly, given the authors, I think it's a great report. I do have a few comments that I will give them. But just a general comment on the recommendations. I also think the staff did a good job of drafting the recommendations, but there were a few things in the few recommendations in the report that didn't make it into this draft of the recommendation. And I noted, I think it was A4 and 5 in the report recommendations, and C1 through C1, 2, and 3. So it's an appropriate point. I think I'm just going to ask why we didn't include those in the recommendation that we'll be talking about today.
Thank you. Any other general questions or comments? Okay, great. So we do not have a preamble yet. We will have that next time around. And so if we can, where is Matt? Matt, we can pull up the, yeah, great. And these are, Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, redlined with the comments that and suggestions we received from Jack Bierman.
That's correct. I've included
Great.
all of those, as well as his comments on the side, which hopefully will display here in a second.
Okay, great.
Let me know if I need to do anything like that.
Is there, I don't know if it's just me, is there a way to lose the pane on the left? Just, yeah, close. So I think that gives us more. Does that work better for everybody? I'm trying to get my chat function to show as well, so give me 1 second. Okay, great. So we'll start, I guess, at the top, right with the very first recommendation here, 1, and we can consider 1A through C. Let's just see generally if there are comments or suggestions here, and then we can look specifically at Jack's, and I'll ask Jack to kind of explain a little bit why he's recommending what he's recommending. So anything in general on this first recommendation? Okay. Jack?
Yeah, if you want me to do them all at once, or you want me to do them one by one?
If we can just do 1A through C, yeah, we could do
Okay.
them all together if that's helpful.
Yeah, okay. The first adding if so when was just because then the first sentence captures everything in the recommendation. So I just thought that was a good opening sentence. These are mostly wordsmithing, not really substantive.
Okay,
And I'm just a little obsessed, with that sort of thing.
as we all are.
And in A and B, where I recommended taking out the word regularly, it's because even if they don't do it regularly, if they ever do it, they should consider this, even if they don't do it that often. It just didn't seem to me to be important there. In future cases, I thought that once you say precedent, it's implicit that you're talking about future cases. So, in the economy of language, I always take out any words that I think aren't necessary. And then the reason I just recommended taking sift through, again, that's just wordsmithing. It just seems sift through seemed like a informal way of saying something that I just prefer not, just a language thing.
Any comments on that? Jeff? Oh, you're muted. Yeah.
I'm not commenting on Jack's, which I think are fine, but I'm commenting on Jeremy's comment in the side where he's saying that the preamble will clarify which agency decisions constitute appellate decisions. I'm glad he said that, because that was my main problem with the first recommendation. Appellate decisions can mean a lot of different things, and it was confusing to me, that just as a term. But I also wonder whether it's the right term, whether or not it should be something like final agency decisions, or I'm not sure if that's better necessarily, but appellate decisions, we don't usually talk about agency appellate decisions. So that's just an odd turn of phrase, it seems to me. So we're really talking about the final agency decision. We're excluding initial decisions, even those that don't get appealed, I think. But I don't know. I guess I'd ask our consultants about that.
Any input on that question from our consultants?
Matt, are you gonna? I think Matt might. I'm gonna volunteer Matt.
I think what Jeff says is sound. I think what Jeff says is sound, subject to explaining the relationship between final agency decisions and what we call appellate decisions in the preamble.
And then in 2, you just say indications that an agency decision. I mean, we're talking about agency decisions here. And we need to explain somewhere what that means, but I think that's better than appellate decisions.
I mean, I think why we used appellate, or why we thought about using appellate, was just to underscore that we're not talking about like trial level decisions. And the worry is that or hearing level decisions. And I know it's complicated. It's like the PTAB. What is that? I mean, they're reviewing a patent examiner's determination, which isn't a hearing in any event. But I think the appellate, I thought it was helpful to kind of, for the reader to kind of realize, because I'd hate for a reader to kind of read the recommendation and just jump to the idea that somehow this is going to be applying to ALJ decisions or the like. We still have to define in the preamble to be sure and say it's more complicated than this. But I do think it helps kind of underscore that this is a agency head decision, or the appellate body that's been delegated the agency head's authority, or the appellate body that the statute has given the authority to make make precedential decisions.
What if we said final agency and then put in parentheses appellate? And then later on, you don't have to repeat that and just say final agency decision or agency decision.
So I have 3 hands. Looks like Lauren, I think you were up first. Is this relating to this point? Great. Please go ahead.
It is. So recognizing that we're trying to capture well more than what the Executive Office for Immigration Review's situation is in regard to these decisions, our situation could be similar to others in that we would not want to be referring to immigration judge decisions as potentially precedential. And I recognize that those are some of the considerations outlined below. The problem, of course, would be related principally to volume, but then also just even the case-specific factual determinations that come into play with each of those individual cases. The immigration judge decisions are considered final agency decisions unless appealed by either the Department of Homeland Security or the non-citizen. So because of that, our preference would be appellate in this circumstance, if it could be appropriately defined in the preamble, as you discussed, to capture other situations in which we need to focus on final agency decisions.
Thank you. Jack, did you have a comment on this?
I thought Bill had his hand up first, but
Oh, we can go to Bill first. If you're willing to let Bill
I do
speak
have a hand.
first.
My comment is on this, but let Bill go.
Okay.
Let me first say that I agree with all of Jack's stylistic changes. Amazing, I had the same ones. But on this issue in particular, there are agencies that adopt ALJ decisions as their own. I mean, ALJ, not just IJ, ALJ decisions as their own, I think. And I don't know if they would want to consider them, or maybe would want to consider them to be precedential. Putting appellate in parentheses, that just confuses me even more. I mean, if you just said final agency decisions, well, the point is obviously what follows says if we don't make precedential a lot of final agency decisions because there's so many or whatever reason, but even if you include within our overall framework final agency decisions, then you break down to which ones are going to be precedential and which ones not, and the agency can eliminate whole scores of them or categories of them easily. So I don't know why final agency decision doesn't do it, and then thereafter we talk about precedential decisions and what to be done with them. That's my comment.
Okay, Jack.
Yeah, I think I'm in pretty much agreement with what Bill just said. I just wanted to point out that sometimes an agency can take a decision without an ALJ hearing it first, and so those wouldn't really be considered appellate. I mean, unless you just consider by nature that the agency is, always in an appellate situation. I mean, I'm not sure they ever do it, but I think that some agency, whether it's an independent agency or the head of a department, can take a case even before the ALJ makes a decision. So appellate might not capture everything. Final agency decisions. And I guess it makes me think, wait, is there a reason to add the word adjudicatory somewhere in here? Maybe that helps clarify it, or maybe that just muddies the waters even more. I don't know.
Hi,
So I'm not exactly sure what I would land. I completely understand the concern about appellate, but I guess I want to underscore what I think Lauren was raising, which is something I thought as soon as the recommendation was final agency decision. I mean, at the EOC, there are things called FADs, final agency decisions, which is the final decision from an agency before it gets appealed to the EOC, well, before it gets sent to an AJ and then the EOC. So I think I'm leaning towards having some word like appellate and then having that described and explained in the preamble to include any number of these points that were just made. Again, the reason I started by saying I'm not sure is for the reasons that have been described, but I'm uncomfortable with taking out appellate. And I also think final agency parentheses appellate is not necessarily so helpful. So just wanted to underscore what I think Lauren was saying.
so just to be clear, it's my understanding that the report uses appellate decisions. And I think Chris has explained why. And to the extent that some of these concerns can be fleshed out, as noted in Jeremy's comment, when we clarify what exactly we mean by that in the preamble, maybe that's the better approach here. And to the extent that it can include some of the final agency concepts that I think Jeff was looking for here. So it sounds like a mixed bag, but maybe we leave it consistent with the report for now and then see how it shakes out for the preamble. And Jeff, we can see if that addresses some of your concern once they explain fully in the preamble. I can definitely see this both ways as well. Any other comments or suggestions on 1A through C? It seems everybody's fine with Jack's. Great. Hi. You had something.
This is just, I want to confirm, right, that the preamble will explain what we mean by precedential. I mean, I know the report does, and because I have some issues just from my
With the
EOC
definition. Mhm.
experience. So there will, I just want to confirm that, and we'll be able to see that in the next meeting.
I would think that it would. So, Lauren.
Thank you. Yeah, understanding that the intent is certainly not how I'm going to refer and see when it talks about to identify which cases merit closer attention. Just possibly looking at the language there to make clear that we don't mean attention in making the decision, but attention in terms of whether that would be precedential.
This is in C.
Correct. I know a lot of agencies, including ours, do have a large volume, and that it is a lot to refer to the language. I agree with being struck, sift through. Certainly each case is given its proper attention. It's just the looking at it overall.
Do you have thoughts on language that might address that, or you're?
I unfortunately didn't notice this until now.
So just now, that's fine.
Yeah. Give me a moment. I will think of something.
Hi, do you have an idea?
I have an idea on a different point on lines 12 to 13, a different point. So, but if you want me to say that while Lauren, it's a small point.
Yeah, sure, sure.
I completely agree with Jack's edits. I think though, once you have that edits, which maybe should be that, you know, it's the extent to which an agency issues such a large volume of decisions that adjudicators cannot reasonably be expected to identify which decisions merit closer attention. The which made sense when you're saying which adjudicators cannot reasonably be expected to sift through, you know. I don't know if that's right. I've been reading this a few times. I just thought I'd raise it.
Jack agrees. He's giving you thumbs up, so.
Okay, okay, cool.
I think I have something to at least throw out to see if it sticks.
Yeah, no, throw out. That's what we want, and we can always
Um,
massage.
How about to identify which cases should serve to guide future case determinations? Or which decisions, sorry, should serve.
Which
to
decisions
guide-
should, say it again?
Should serve to guide future determinations. Or even should guide future determinations, to be more precise or more briefer.
Hmm. I like that. Any reaction one way or the other? I see some nodding.
I like it a lot.
Can I?
Yes, Jack.
I'm thinking my initial reaction is positive, except maybe the word should be may. Because we don't know, we don't know. I mean, that which can reasonably be expected to identify which decisions may may merit, I would say almost maybe may merit treatment as precedent without guidance from the agency. I don't know, something like that. I think I'm agreeing with the thought, but because we're basically saying the agency should tell them which ones. So
I totally follow you. I'm just wondering, in reading it with the piece of the sentence prior to the colon, is it strange to say whether should be treated as precedential and then to identify which may merit treatment as precedent? I almost feel like
yeah,
that's
you're
just
right.
saying,
Yeah, that's may.
Go back to should. If you go back to should.
yeah, I think I may like should better. Also, I was
Okay.
on board with may, but
Yeah.
Hi.
Yeah, I I think this is good. And just I want to say, I think it's because, so in deciding, let's say, whether some as opposed to all should be treated as precedential, one of the things they should consider is the extent to which the agency issues such a large volume that adjudicators cannot reasonably be expected to identify essentially on their own. I mean, this is
Right.
what you're trying to get without guidance from the agency. I don't know that we need to put it in here,
yeah.
but I think in the preamble discussing it, it's that we can't expect them to, depending on what precedential means, which is why that's so important, that you can't expect them to identify which should be considered precedential without some statement from the agency, some guidance.
and now I'm back to may. Reason being, I think I could imagine sort of a triage effect, right? That the individual adjudicator may look at it and say, this could be precedential, and it would go to be determined as to whether that would actually serve as precedent, because the large volume of decisions may prevent the individual adjudicator from being able to make that decision in a vacuum, but an agency process could perhaps result in the should rather than the may. So I think may be more appropriate here after all.
I have one other suggestion, if I might, is whether guides should be bind. I'd like to think all decisions somewhat guide future determinations, but maybe I'm being silly. Any thoughts on that as we have it? Hi, you still have your hand up, so.
Yeah, I know. And actually, I do have another point. Even based on this, on the may, I like bind probably better than guide, essentially based on what I'm thinking precedent should mean. But maybe it's then may appropriately bind, right? To identify which decisions may appropriately bind future determinations. Again, this whole thing is the whole reason, right, on this, to say to those agencies that haven't yet done this, hey, all, you might want to, if you issue such a large volume, that you just can't reasonably expect them to identify which should appropriately bind. So I just
Any-
think you might need to say appropriately.
Okay, any reaction to that? Jeff?
And do you bind a determination or do you control a determination?
Ah,
Yeah.
I like that better, even better. Yes. Anything else on this phrasing here? I say we call it. Okay, great. Let us move on to recommendation 2. Again, we have some edits here from Jack. Anything you want to add here, Jack? I see your comment on the side. We can all read that. Jack, anything? Not.
No, I think
Okay.
it's self-explanatory.
Okay. Any reactions to the language that Jack has proposed here? Okay. Anything on the list under 2?
So
Jeff?
maybe I'm being too picky here, but this recommendation as worded now, if you move up a little, go back to the beginning, doesn't really, it's not a recommendation to anybody. As it was before. I mean, I know it's wordier the way it was before, but now it's just sort of a statement. I don't know if that should bother us or not, but
Hi.
Yeah, I do think that's an important point. I like that we keep it as recommendations. And the other thing that I think is helpful, perhaps if you go back to, in determining whether to treat. No.
No,
says
on 2. We're
lines
still on
15
2.
to 18.
Yes.
It's just
Yep.
15 to 18. But let's assume you didn't take Jack's change, which you just, I mean, I'm just
It's the
putting back-
deleted,
It's the
deleted language.
deleted section, that's all.
Correct.
So,
Right.
but in determining whether to treat an appellate decision as present, I feel like we need to, here you said, agencies that distinguish between precedential and non-precedential. And I think part of what we're saying in this recommendation is agencies need to determine. So sort of like, you have 2 things here. You have agencies that already distinguish between the 2, and you have agencies like the EEOC, where although the report says that the agency does make that distinction, it actually doesn't. There are some that are done by the full commission that sort of people pay more attention to, but as a matter of precedent, the commission has never made that decision. So I think what you're trying to say in this recommendation is, in determining whether to treat only some appellate decisions as precedential, okay? Which is already, some agencies are doing it and some aren't. In determining whether to treat only some appellate decisions as precedential, the agency should consider, something like that, because, yeah.
Bill?
Although I understand that
Oh,
you're also trying to
ahead.
talk to agencies that have already made the distinction, but without thinking it through. So I just want to make sure that that point is not lost by this proposal.
Yeah, I mean, you're trying to cover agencies that have never thought of it or never done anything about it, but then there are some who have, right? And I know you're thinking of implementation. I know exactly where your mind's going, Hi, since you're on the implementation committee. Bill.
That resolved my question.
Aha. We like that. We like when that happens. Okay, so the idea would be to keep what was there, but revise it slightly as High suggested. Any thoughts on that, Jack? I know, well, Jeff, we'll go to Jeff first and then we'll see where Jeff.
I think it's probably fine, but this wouldn't apply to SSA and VA because they've decided not to have any presidential decision, right? So I think that's one of the reasons it was worded the way it was originally, because it was trying to get rid of both ends of the spectrum. I mean, maybe we should hear from the staff as to why they drafted it that way, but.
Hi, do you have a suggestion? And then we can see if.
No, what I
Jeremy.
want to say is that Jack has said exactly what I wanted to not lose in this.
Right.
Okay, so yes, I just wanted to say that's what I want to make sure we don't lose. It's just that the way it was initially written doesn't capture something else.
Right. Jack, and then we'll hear from staff.
What I understand the problem with what I wrote in that it turns into a list of factors. The problem that the problem that led me to think about suggesting a change was that we don't actually say that these point in favor of treating these particular kinds of decisions as precedential. It seems like, I mean, maybe it's just so obvious, but imagine, I mean, it doesn't say like that if it's an issue of first impression, it ought to be precedential. Someone might say, well, it's our first time ever trying to deal with this problem, so maybe we ought to be a little careful and not treat it as precedential yet. But I think the intent was that all of these are points leaning in favor of treating them as precedential. And I think I'm not coming up with a way to say it, but I think that we need to, if that's what the intent is, then we need to say that. Something like, in determining whether to treat only some appellate decisions precedential, it should treat
them as precedential if.
Yeah, the agency should, seriously consider, or, I mean, something like, I don't know, but, something like that.
Before we get to Bill and then Lauren, anything from staff, Jeremy or Matt? I just want to give you a chance here. Jeff.
I'll speak quickly on this, and then Jeremy can clarify if he had a different take. I think your interpretation of what we were attempting to do is correct, that we were creating 3 categories of agencies: those that treat all decisions as precedential, those that treat some and distinguish between the two, and those that don't use precedent at all, and then crafted each of the recommendations flooding from that to identify which category it applies to and what those agencies in that circumstance should do. And then at the bottom, how and which agencies in each position should codify these rules.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, if you look at recommendation 1 right now, basically says agencies should establish a policy that all appellate decisions are precedential, some are precedential, or none are precedential. If you decide that all or none are precedential, there's no need to determine which particular decision in a given system should or should not be given precedential effect. So
Right.
2 assumes you've chosen that sort of middle path.
Right. Okay. Bill, let's hear from Bill and then Lauren.
I thought, as Jack's original point had been, that this was a list of things to decide whether or not a particular decision should be considered precedential. And if that's true, if that's what this list is, then I think you should take out only, and determining whether to treat some appellate decisions as precedential, they should consider the following. And then I don't see why that is inconsistent with an agency that considers all of them precedential. They don't have to decide individual cases. And for agencies who decide there's no precedence, they don't have to decide either. So you don't have to say, I don't think, that this only applies to those agencies that make decisions about some and not others. That's my view.
Thanks, Lauren.
Language suggestion, perhaps combining, in determining whether to treat only some appellate decisions as precedential, indications in favor of treating as precedent include. And then I think we would unfortunately have to change all of the enumerated pieces to gerunds, but instead of the current more proper verbs, but.
So we lose the reference to agencies, which I think was the concern initially, that it's just a list as opposed to a recommendation.
Yeah, in determining whether agencies treat only some appellate decisions as precedential. I'm adding that now, you didn't miss it. Indications in favor of treating as precedent include. Again, just suggestion.
No, thank you. Jeff, did you have something? I see you're unmuted, so.
Well, I was trying to address the same point. I was going to put something at the end. It's
At the end?
you should consider the following factors which
Which
lean
favor,
towards, you know,
which,
favor-
yeah.
favor making them precedential or something like that. Putting it at the end rather than at the beginning, but I don't have a strong feeling about it.
So let's go back. Oh, Jack. I'll let you.
I was just trying to do some drafting here.
Yeah.
What I came up with, I think it's very similar, but in agencies that treat only some appellate decisions as precedential, indications that a particular decision should be treated as precedential include.
You might need to say it again.
Include.
And
I'm sorry,
agencies that
agencies
treat only some.
Include. What did I say here? Include whether indications. Okay, I'm sorry. In agencies that treat only some decisions as precedential, indications that an appellate decision should be treated as precedential.
Include the following.
Yes.
Include whether the decision. No, include whether the decision. Colon.
Okay. Hi.
So that brings me back to this raises the issue to which I had first raised a concern, which is it sounds like this recommendation is only directed to agencies that have already decided this. Now, I know that recommendation number 1 says you should decide, but you might need to repeat that, right? In agencies that choose to treat only some decisions as precedential, indications that an appellate should be, I mean, this is, we can see how repetitive this language is.
Yeah.
I think we can work with that, but in agencies that choose to treat only some decisions as precedential, indications.
Move appellate to the first decisions.
Some appellate decisions as precedential. Indications that.
That other decisions. I mean, there's a category of decisions they consider precedential. Yeah. My concern is that we're not getting at what you just said, Hi, which is that there are agencies who may have chose one path or another and maybe should rethink the all or nothing, right?
Correct. I think this recommendation can be very helpful to agencies that issue a lot of decisions that in practice, as you sort of got from your interview with the EOC, in practice, they don't really, quote unquote, sift through everything But they will certainly have in their mind something that's been voted on by the commission. But they have not made that decision. And I think they should. And when they now choose to actually differentiate between their decisions, these are precisely the indications that they should be looking at.
So what if we went back to Jack's and said something like indications for agencies that are determining whether
Mhm.
an appellate decision ought to be treated as precedential? No,
There's some appellate decision.
But that's where we're getting to only some. And whether only some appellate decisions ought to be treated as precedential.
I have one to throw out.
sure, go ahead, Lauren.
When agencies determine only some appellate decisions will be precedential, serious consideration should be given to such issuance if the decision, colon. I can read it again if you'd like. When agencies determine only some appellate decisions will be precedential, serious consideration should be given to such issuance if the decision, colon.
Such a designation.
But again, is that limiting?
Well, I like this approach. I'm sorry, this is
No, go ahead, hon. That's fine.
when
Your hand is
agencies,
still up, so.
yeah, oh my God. Okay. Let's lower it now. So I think we need a, maybe that, when agencies determine that only some appellate decisions will be precedential. I'm not sure that we need serious. I mean, consideration should be serious, right? When they determine there will be precedential, consideration should be given to whether such a decision, and then the colon.
Jack,
But we're back to the problem that set me off on this
Yep.
originally, which is that it doesn't say these are positive considerations or negative considerations, which I think
Yep.
we have to specify.
Let's
I
say
thought-
positive consideration.
yeah, I thought we were a little closer with the, indications in favor of treating, some of that language. But I'm not sure how we build that back in. Jeremy, you have a fix. I know.
Can I
you-
try, let me try something, and if not, I think
Please
we get
try.
the committee on style can always try this, but how about something like agencies that choose to treat only some appellate decisions as precedential should, in determining whether to treat a decision as precedential, consider whether the decision, colon, and I can send you that language, Matt, if others like it, but agencies that choose to treat only some appellate decisions as precedential should, in determining whether to treat a decision as precedential, consider whether the decision, colon.
It doesn't have that it's a positive indication language, which is the only thing that's the thing I'm most
I think it's
concerned
implied. I think it's implied in what Jeremy's come up with, that you're going to treat it as precedent if these things exist. I think.
No, that's exactly the same as the first
You
formulation.
could say should consider treating a decision as precedential if it, colon.
Something like
Agencies.
that.
Yeah,
Okay,
agencies-
let's try
yeah.
that.
So agencies that choose to treat only some appellate decisions as precedential should consider treating a decision as precedential if it, colon.
Matt, is it possible to get rid of some of the other language above so that we can clear the field a little for Jeremy's solution? I get a thumbs up from Bill, which is a good sign. Jack?
Yeah, I was trying to figure out whether I liked my last version of it better, but then it disappeared, so.
Yeah,
it
we
seems
can put
fine
it
to
back,
me.
we can put it back in. It's right there.
What I had written was an agency that choose to treat only some appellate decisions as presidential. Indications that a decision should be treated as presidential include whether the decision. I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm indifferent between the two. It's the same point. Whatever the committee prefers is fine with me.
So there's two options now on the table. Any thoughts on which one? Jack has not indicated a preference, right? Okay,
I like Jeremy's because it's shorter.
okay. Hi,
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think Jeremy's getting rid of the rest gets to our point.
Lauren is nodding. Anybody else? Okay, sold. Thank you, Jeremy. And thank you, Jack, for raising the, the issue that, we were trying to capture here. I think we got it. Anything on the list? Okay, great. Let's move to the next. Number 3. So we have a comment here for committee discussion. Should we move this to another subsection, and do we need subsections? It's a relatively short recommendation, so I understand why this is being asked, and whether headings and subsections make a difference here. Does anybody have a thought on that yet, or want to reserve judgment until we get through it? Jeff? Oh, you're muted. You're muted. Sorry.
Isn't
There we
this covered also in 13H?
This particular recommendation?
Yeah, it seems we're saying agency should clarify for what purposes a party may cite a non-precedential decision. And in 13H, we say that the rules should explain when and for what purposes a party may cite a non-precedential decision. I mean, it's there twice.
I think the critical part is probably that first part, which is the affirmative should not prohibit parties from doing so. Whereas 13 just says explain how parties can do it without putting a sort of thumb on the scale.
That's what I saw. I saw 3 as being the actual should not prohibit, whereas 13H assumed you weren't prohibiting it, but didn't say you shouldn't prohibit.
Hi.
Number one, I think subheadings are good, again, in terms of implementation. And 2, I think it's very important to keep the first part of 3 in this section, okay? Even if you're going to decide that only some will be precedential, agencies should not prohibit parties from citing them in written or oral arguments. I then think I would then, even though it is duplicative of 13H, again, just thinking about implementation, I don't have a problem with repeating it, because otherwise it's like, well, wait, then what does it make a difference? If you don't prohibit, so saying, but you clarify when and for what purposes a party may cite a non-precedential decision and how the agency will consider it, I think that makes sense, keeping in this first section. And then later on, we give the more suggestions on how they might want to consider it, et cetera. At least the report did. So I want to speak in favor of keeping lines 32 to 34 as they are.
And maybe once we get to 13, there's some adjustment maybe that we
Right.
could make to recognize that we're covering some of the same territory, perhaps. Is it possible, Matt, to just copy 13H up so we can just compare the two? Oh, no, it's linked to, never mind. It's got a prefatory, it's in a list, so it might be hard to kind of see the context. It's about establishing a rule, which I think is what Jeremy said, right? Okay. Oh,
It seems to me that, I mean, one of the things that concerned me about this was I would want them to not only to, I want them to cite it and say, and this is a non-precedential decision. I want them to identify it as a non-precedential.
absolutely.
And I think that should be in the recommendation, but rather than worrying about 3H and so forth, what about having a subhead here that says use? I mean, the heading here is use of precedential decision-making. Why not have another head that says use of non-precedential decision-making?
So that would come ahead of 3.
That would come ahead of, then 3 would be 1, or I guess would be, yeah, would be 3, before 3, right? And then we could put both what we had as 3 and also what was in H, put that in as a subhead of here. So
Any thoughts on that?
because that way we deal with non-precedential all in one place. And the subhead would say, as part of their rules of practice, agency rules should, and then we did just
Explain when and for what.
just put in H.
Any thoughts? I see nodding. Can we give to the committee on style A, smooth that out for this new section, this new subsection? So I think we're keeping subsections. So for now, that's where we're landing for that.
And could the committee on style also make clear that when they cite the non-precedential decision, they identify it as a
Absolutely.
non-precedential decision? I don't know how to say it, but I'll leave that to the committee of style.
Lauren,
I think I'm saying almost the same thing that was in that just a standard for like a blue book, if you will, for how the case is cited specifically. Yeah.
I know we make that very clear in our own, my agency's rules, that when you're citing, it's in the citation forms rule, basically, that if you're citing something non-precedential, you need to identify it as such. Okay, great. Let's move on to 4. I know Jack had some thoughts here, and I think he read my mind in some of them. So, Jeff, do you want to be heard before I turn it to Jack? You're muted. That's okay. We've all been there.
This is a place where 3 of the recommendations in the report didn't make it into this section. And it's the ones on page 51 of the report, C1 through 3. And C4, 5, 6, and 7 are the ones that made it into here. But 1 through 3 didn't. And I think it might be worth spending a little time to decide whether or not we want to say what's in C1 through 3. We can do that after Jack finishes.
Okay. Jack, did you have any further comment on 4?
Well, I guess I wanted to hear the reason why we would why we wouldn't want to get input from everybody, in the list on 5 in the situation of 4 on a new one. I mean, I understand that we're talking about maybe doing a look back in number 5 to pre-existing decisions, but I'd like to hear the reasoning for this because I didn't understand it. But at the time I did this, I didn't read the report, although I don't recall now. I read the report quickly. I don't recall if this was explained.
Matt or Chris or Melissa? Any responses?
So can you clarify? I didn't quite understand. Can you say again?
Well, no, I mean, there's for new decisions, I guess, the idea is to only get appellate adjudicators to chime in on whether to make a new decision as precedential. But with regard to a look back, where you look at old decisions and decide whether to designate some pre-existing ones, you ask all adjudicators, other agency officials, the parties of the case, and the public. And I
Yeah.
just didn't understand. I just was trying to figure out the reason for the different treatment.
Yeah, I think what we were trying to do, right, for the new decisions was simply give the opportunity for other adjudicators to kind of review them to see if there was kind of conflict with other decisions before they were issued as precedential. And I thought the input from, I think it's a good point, but like the input from others, I think that's a fair point. When I was thinking of initially, it was the new decisions we were thinking about getting input from other adjudicators before it was sort of issued as conflict with other decisions that were out there. But we are asking for input from the public and other adjudicators and deciding, when we're making earlier on before a decision is addressed as precedential as well. So I think it's a good point taken.
I mean, I
Thank
do think
you.
we were trying to, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, please, Chris.
I mean, I think we were trying to address something different there. I mean, and maybe it's just not clear enough, but the idea, as most of us, saying, the idea of the first one is that you should pre-circulate, or at least you consider pre-circulating a decision. So you decide to make a precedential pre-circulate, like some of the circuit courts do. And I'm using circuit courts here for Jack's, benefit. But the other one is like more generally, you should solicit input on whether to make decisions precedential, whether they're new decisions or old decisions or the like. But that was kind of what we were getting at, because some agencies do pre-circulation within the whole appellate body. And I think we thought that was a really good practice, but that's different than like when the AG says, I'm thinking of making a precedential decision in the immigration context, semi-amicus briefs. Like that, to me, that's a different approach.
But can I just? Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
No,
Go ahead. Go ahead, Jack.
Without commenting on whether the Circuit Court of Cook County or any actual existing circuit court does anything like that, because there are no federal circuit courts, haven't been for over 100 years. But the last clause in number 5 actually already captures. I didn't even focus on this. I would recommend taking the word certain out of that last clause on line 42, but you've already got the whole group on pending matters. So it just seems like number 4 is saying, ask this narrow group on pending matters. And then the number 5 says ask the whole group on pending matters. So it's actually, it seems like it's saying the same thing anyway. I think it would, I think we probably just can do without number 4. Number 5 captures the whole thing. And designate, pending or existing, existing decisions, or whether to resolve a pending one. It's the same thing, and I understand that there may be an issue with confidentiality of a pending decision, if it's, and so, but maybe we could add, maybe that could be taken care of with another sentence or in the preamble or something like that.
Okay, Jeff. We can't hear you. Sorry.
I was going to talk about the other recommendations.
Okay. Okay. All right, Bill.
I really don't like the solution because I think it mixes apples and oranges. Old 4, or 4 that's been crossed out, is saying as a general rule, right, you should circulate a proposed decision among the other appellate people. And that is routinely done on federal courts of appeals, if not federal circuit courts. And it's good practice, all right? And it ought to be done in the agencies. At least as a general rule, we should say they should do that. Now, the separate issue, right? And the separate issue is number 5, which is, one, look back. That's one issue of 5. And the other one is there may be some extraordinary cases that you might want to do more than just circulate it among the other appellate adjudicators. And in those cases, that could come under this. But so there's sort of 3 different ideas here. One is what you do in every case, which is to send it among the other appellate adjudicators. 2, what you do when you go do a look back to involve other people. And then 3, what you do in certain extreme cases. And I certainly don't want to have every case go to the public to determine whether or not it should be precedential. That's just too much. Sorry.
Hi.
So that was going to be exactly my point. So without repeating that, just to underscore that I think 4 should stay the way it is, which is now when you're thinking about the process, if you're going to have only some be precedential, you might want to consider input from just the other adjudicators, not anyone else. Then, especially if you're an agency that is now for the first time going to be doing decisions about existing. So I don't think you need appellate adjudicators not involved in deciding the case because it's no longer the case. So I'm just speaking for going back to the original language. Now consider input from any adjudicator, other agency that have whether to designate, again, take out pending, right? Because I'm recommending going back to the language for the reasons Bill said, whether to designate existing appellate decisions as precedential. Okay, that's concept 2. Then maybe let's hear, actually, if we could hear from the consultants as to what they mean by certain pending matters. That's, if we could understand what they mean, and if it's then a 3rd category, then it should just have its 3rd number. But I don't understand what that was intended to capture. So can we just hear about that?
Chris or Melissa or Matt?
Yeah, sure. So I think the idea of the resolve the pending matters, and you know, again, if you look at the report's recommendations, which you shouldn't, but like these are actually all separated out, and it's more one of the other best practices that was identified at some agencies is they had a process for ALJs to certify questions to an appellate body to make a precedential decision out of. They also had processes for interlocutory review of certain decisions, or even just questions within a case that allowed for the appellate body to come in quickly and kind of provide an answer to that question. They also, some had opportunities to, when a case before it was decided, the parties themselves be able to say, we think you should publish this decision. Like it should be precedential. It shouldn't just be because it's a recurring issue the agency has. And so I think that's the idea of like, the first one is pre-circulation. The second one is have people help identify cases that are already, decisions that are already published, whether to make them precedential. And the third one was kind of more the interlocutory, in some circumstances, you might want to allow for the public, for ALJs, for agency adjudicators, appellate adjudicators to kind of jump in and suggest to the agency, you might want to tackle this right now because we've got a lot of other cases just like this. So they are kind of 3 different categories. Although I do understand why 4 and 5 are the way they are now. Like I understand why the staff did that, but I would probably break them out into 3 if the committee thinks that third one is worth highlighting in the recommendation.
I think Kai at least thinks that it would be.
I do, but I also think now that you've explained that, it might be that it comes, that concept comes before 5, because you're saying this is about something that's pending. This isn't about going back to your existing. So something like, right, agencies should consider a process for receiving input on whether certain pending matters should be addressed but with a precedential decision. I mean, that's not exactly the right wording, I don't think, but I think it's capturing what you just told us. essentially it's input beyond the appellate adjudicators, right? So 4 is, generally.
Do we need to include in 5 the list of possible? Or you're just saying establish a process?
Yeah, I mean, you probably do want to include the list. The whole thing here is
Mhm.
about processes, sort of. So, so maybe just should consider receiving input instead of a process for, right? Consider soliciting input. from the
Consider soliciting
appellate.
would be consistent with
Right.
4.
Should consider soliciting input from adjudicated certain pending matters, and then should consider soliciting input from the same group, whether to designate existing ones as precedential. And I think you just time-wise feels more logical.
Bill?
Well, I like the idea we've broken it out, but I don't think it's quite responsive to Chris Walker's point in the sense that it's not it's providing a system by which ALJs, as I understood it, would certify questions to the appellate body to make a decision in a pending matter. And as it is now, it's not agency should consider soliciting input. We need something to trigger it, all right? And that agencies should consider creating a procedure by which an initial adjudicator may certify a question to the appellate body, whatever we call them, appellate body, to make a precedential decision. Such a procedure could include soliciting input from blah, 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 blah. And then just end with, and the public.
Yes. I was trying to capture what Chris was saying, and
I know.
Chris, you can tell us if that's, but I think that sounds right to me, why I came up with process.
Chris, do you have any reaction? No, that's fine if you don't. That's fine.
I mean, not surprisingly, I'm probably a fan of how we put it in the report.
We're probably also, Nadine, if I may, we probably also want
Sure.
to look back at the recommendation on agency appellate systems to see what it says about interlocutory appeals and certification of questions by hearing level adjudicators. I think there's something in there on that. I do know that there's something on that subject in the ACUS model adjudication rules. So we probably ought to, between now and the next meeting, take a look at that.
Thank you, Matt. Matt, not Weiner. I think also Matt was saying to look at the model rules as well. Just for your comment. Lauren.
A question, looking at this procedure by through initial adjudicator, is that a burdensome process that would restrict the ability for agencies to carry it out that way? Is there an alternative by which there could be maybe just like and this is obviously very unartful, but an ongoing list or something of issues known that if they come up would be the kind of thing carried forward for consideration for solicitation of comment for purposes of consideration of the precedent? So put more briefly, is this the most efficient way to form the recommendation from the eyes of those in the agency and in the individual adjudicators?
Well, I do think that the language about creating a procedure would obviously leave to the agencies what that procedure sort of looks like, right? And I hear what you're saying, that you're adding kind of another thing for us to do. So to the extent that at least the language that's proposed now, does leave it to the agency to create a procedure to allow this to happen. And maybe it can be streamlined in the way you're suggesting, once that gets to the agency for implementation. Any reactions? So at this point, 4 is still in, we have a new 5, and 6 is still in. Any reactions to 4, 5, and 6 as they currently stand? Jack, you've been quiet. I assume this is okay. Okay. Any other reactions to 4, 5, and 6? And I think in this subsection, is there just 7, the remaining one? And 8, okay. It would be good to go through 7 and 8, and then we can loop back around to Jeff's question about the other aspects of the report. So anything on 7 or 8? And these are, again, Jack had some suggestions here. No reactions. Anything on 8? So I think Jack's point here was that this is understood, perhaps. Bill?
Well, I was just going to say, I think we need to add something here besides just it should consider expressly overruling the decision in whole or part circumstances and explain why and explain that decision. I mean, that's the real point of Allentown Mac and Fox Broadcasting, Fox Television.
I wondered if, the should consider is the right language, or if this is just understood. Hi.
Sorry. I just want to say, by the way, that on 7, I know there was no comments, but I just want to say how positive I think that is. Really positive. On 8, I'm not sure that I understand why only consider expressly overruling. It just seems to me
Have to.
you have to. And in fact, I think that's part of the problem sometimes. So it should expressly overrule the decision in whole or in part as the circumstances dictate and explain its new decision, or
Jeff is going to have thoughts on this. Yes.
So this still needs some wordsmithing there.
Jeff.
Wouldn't this apply to modifying the decision as well? Well, I'm
No,
saying
I think
Well, I
when an
think
agency rejects, disavows, or modifies the holding of a presidential decision.
Modifies, rejects, or disavows.
Yeah.
Up there, modify. No,
above
first line.
59.
When an agency modifies, modifies
First.
Yeah, modifies first. The least first.
Well, then is it expressly?
It should explain that it is doing that and why.
Yeah, because we're not overruling that, right?
Yes. See that I would strongly recommend not to put in modify in this sense. Okay, we may want to talk about modifying, but I think the key thing here is that when they reject or disavow the holding of a precedential decision, it should expressly overrule the decision in whole or in part as the circumstances dictate. Okay, because they might not overrule the whole thing. you know, and I actually don't think we need to say and explain its new decision. I mean, the important thing here is that they should overrule it and not let both of them stand. I think if they're just modifying, then by definition, they will be referring to that precedential decision and just modifying it. That will be in the decision. So I'm sort of less concerned about telling them, hey, you know, reference that previous one and get rid of it. If you're just modifying, I think probably, but, or maybe not, maybe they're modifying but not referencing the old precedent, in which case the rules should be, you have to then expressly refer to the precedent you're modifying. This is all just about notice and non-confusion.
Would that be a new, like a separate, do you think that could be a separate?
Yes, I think if we
Okay.
want to capture that point, it needs to be a second thing. And number 9.
I'm gonna go to Bill first and then Jeff.
I'm going to argue strongly about putting and explain why it is overruling the decision. I mean, that's the requirement that the courts have put on it. If you just say, we're overruling it, here's our new decision, all right? That's going to be arbitrary and capricious. That's black letter law. So I think you need to put in here and explain why it's overruling the decision.
I was the one that said, yeah, I have no problem with putting that in. I do think that it makes that clear.
Jeff, you put your hand down, so. Okay, Chris,
Technically, I don't think that is the law, but I mean, we're thinking Fox versus FCC. Like, I don't know. I mean, I kind of like the idea of just saying and provide reasons for its decision, not reasons why it is overruling its decision. I mean, that's at least how I read Fox versus FCC. I think explaining why this decision is better than the prior ones, I think what they said you don't have to do, but.
Well, there's a case in the casebook I use, that UAW versus NLRB, where the court says you have to explain why you're changing course.
Yeah, and I never forget that after Fox, we had, you know, judge from the DC Circuit say, I don't know what the hell they were talking about. Of course, they have to explain why it's better. I think I agree. You can read Scalia's opinion the way you do, but I don't think that's the way it's being read.
You don't
Well,
have to,
I mean, the opposite is Justice Stevens' dissent squarely. I mean, I don't. Sorry, I clerked that term. I'm too much into the weeds on this one.
And even if that's a correct reading of Fox, I think it's better policy, and that's what we're talking about here, that they should provide reasons for why it's overruling. I mean, I think that's a good policy, and therefore we ought to recommend it.
All right, I withdraw my amendment. I'll go along with policy. If we don't, if we want to push further than the Supreme Court requires, I'm completely fine with that.
any other thoughts on 8? Okay, Jeff, do you want to go back to the recommendations that you feel should be included from the report?
well, I just want to make sure we talk about them.
Okay.
So again, this is on page 51 of the report, and there are 3 recommendations here, and they're related to recommendations A, 4, and 5, which are also not reflected, and maybe that should have come earlier. But 1 and 2 of them have to do with sort of a middle ground type of designation, where the consultants suggest, and notice that some agencies do this, that agencies should consider whether, even if they do not designate a decision as precedential, they should identify it as, quote, adopted or, quote, informative or the like, because it may be useful to hearing level or appellate adjudicators. So that's one thing that is not in our set of recommendations, and maybe that should have come in earlier if we're going to put it in. But then in C 1, 2, and 3, the 3 recommendations are basically that agencies should consider ways to streamline the decision-making process. Second, for agencies that do have a time-consuming process for designating precedential decisions, they should consider experimenting with these alternative designations. And 3, they should consider whether adjudicators who decide a case should be given authority to designate their decision as precedential at the time it is issued, or instead, such authority should be given to or shared with other adjudicators to be exercised after the decision is issued. So those are 3 thoughts that, I think kind of fit into this recommendation. The drafters didn't put them in there. I don't know. I think they're worthy of consideration, I guess, and maybe Matthew and Jeremy could explain why they didn't put them in and see if our consultants think they should be put in.
Sure.
C1, certainly. I think here it's agencies should consider ways to streamline decision-making. I mean, that's the thrust of lots of ACUS recommendations. And at least from my reading, it's not necessarily recommending anything, except that agencies should think about how to make their processes more efficient. To the extent that the consultants can identify specific ways to streamline decision-making, that might make a useful recommendation, but simply saying agencies should streamline their processes doesn't necessarily recommend anything.
What about those middle ground types of designations?
I will leave that to the committee, whether that's appropriate in a recommendation on precedential decision-making or whether it is almost a different mechanism for ensuring consistency among a portfolio of methods like quality assurance and training and other mechanisms for ensuring consistency.
Chris, I see you have your hand up. Did you want to speak
Yeah,
to
I
it?
mean, on the first one, I think what we were trying to get at, and maybe it's not clear on our part, is, there are some agencies that have really, really elaborate processes for designating decisions of precedential, so they never actually designate any. I think probably the worst example is the USCIS, that they have to go through the Attorney General, the head of DHS, the head of their office, OLC, and get all of the sign off in order to designate any decision as precedential. And that's not a great way to do things if you're trying to designate decisions as precedential. Now, there are also ones that have adopted this middle ground approach of adopted decisions. And so they're not the only ones. There are others that kind of have more complicated processes. I mean, I agree with Jeremy. If it's just do your job, like find ways to do it more quickly, that's maybe not the best. On the flip side, if there's an ACUS recommendation that actually has that, maybe that gives agencies that have problems the ability to kind of go back to their political heads and say, we might want to rethink this. ACUS just issued a recommendation. Looks like we're an outlier, along those lines. So that's kind of my thought on that. On the adopted informative, I wish we even had more, quite frankly, because I think some things that agencies do on their websites is kind of identify big precedential decisions, like these are the ones that really, really matter. And I think that's also helpful when you're, especially at agencies that have issue a lot of precedential decisions, to try to highlight ones that are more important. But that's at least what we were trying to get at in the report with that first one.
Anything further from Matthew or Jeremy?
I mean, I think that point is well taken. I think there's ways that you could specifically say perhaps some systems have too much process. Here's things that could be stripped out, or here are specific ways to streamline processes. That itself might be a very useful recommendation.
I mean, the reason we don't name names is we just don't name names, right?
Right.
I mean, we don't. I mean, in the report we actually do it a little bit. I mean, USCIS has an amazing system. It's not their fault, but just kind of flag that this might allow agencies like that to have a little bit more, at least have a talking point on the agenda when they talk about how to improve their system.
Or they should avoid excessive clearance requirements or something like that.
Right. Maybe identifying clearance requirements and where, in cases in which the costs of those clearance requirements outweigh the benefits. It's some way to say it like that. That might be useful.
Bill, do you have some thoughts on this?
Yeah, my thought is that I think, given the discussion here, the staff and the consultants should try to draft a couple more recommendations reflecting this, for the next meeting, but that we shouldn't try to draft it here by committee.
I agree.
But
That
but I'd certainly like us to address C3 in the report. Consider whether adjudicators who decided case should be given authority to designate their decision. I think that's a fairly important point, and I'm wondering why that wasn't included.
I have to find the recommendation now. I
Yeah,
believe we moved it into 13, basically stating that instead of saying you should consider A or B, you should specifically state in your rules whether you're choosing option A or option B. 13,
A and B.
yeah. I mean, that maybe could be stated more explicitly, but the idea was to move it into agencies shouldn't just consider whether they're going to do A or B. They should do A or they should do B, and they should explicitly say which option they're going with. So maybe that can be brought further up, but it was not excluded from the recommendations, but placed somewhere else.
Okay, I take that point.
So my last point, I know we're sort of interrupting the flow of going through all the rest of the recommendations, but is the recommendation on page 47, which is A4 of the report. This is kind of a broader point that sometimes agencies might be able to address issues that could be addressed through precedential decisions. They might be better addressed through guidance documents, especially in high volume adjudication programs. So it's kind of identifying what SSA is already doing, but we don't have that thought. Maybe it's something that could be put in the preamble only, but it's an important thing to include, that there are other ways to do this.
So our thinking was that it would be preambular. You'd have a recommendation, the preamble that identify there are lots of mechanisms for agencies to ensure consistency or accuracy. We've recently issued a recommendation on quality assurance. Appellate review by itself is a mechanism. Rulemaking is obviously a mechanism. And so there would be a paragraph situating precedential decision-making alongside those other mechanisms for ensuring consistency. That was at least our thinking.
Okay, that's fine with me.
So we'll work on a couple new, 2, maybe 3 additional recommendations to add in this subsection. Okay. Anything further on 4 through 8? Okay. So the next, Matthew, yeah, we can get to availability. Before we go into availability, I think we should take a little break. I'm a firm believer in Zoom fatigue, so maybe a 10-minute break and we'll reconvene and hopefully we can work through the rest in the time we have left. I'll see you in 10.
Yeah.
See, ask and it happens. Look at that, like magic. Okay, so we're back. And we are going to start with the subsection on availability. So it's 9 through, I can't remember if there's, 13. Okay, thank you. So there are some things here from Jack, but let's start with 9. Anything on 9? Hi.
Just my same point as above for agencies that choose to treat some appellate decisions as precedential. Because, well, you've heard me say this. Just it'll make it clear that, hey, agencies should think about whether they should choose. And then if they do, then they're clearly in that category then.
I'll confess to kind of thinking twice about that "on their face" phrase. I'm an old person here, so on their face to me means the paper, right? But obviously we mean anywhere it appears, right? So It's on the paper. If you're still doing paper, it's on the website. It's hopefully if you have a reporter, you have your own, published reporter. I mean, obviously it should be on there somehow, but on their face made me think of paper. When we could mean,
Explicitly?
it says clearly already. But I think some of it is, well, where and how should it be, top page, top of the page, I'm thinking visually of how are we designating it and then making it clear to anybody who happens upon it.
Oh, I hadn't lowered my hand, but actually I actually think that I agree about on their face not being necessary, but I actually think clearly is better than explicitly, because that sort of gets to the point of, hey, just be clear about this. And I actually think this is where the citation idea could be really helpful, because if it's actually a different citation form, that itself will help, folks. So it might be, if we have a citation recommendation, it might end up coming in somewhere around here.
Any other thoughts on 9? So let's look at 10. There's an edit. Oh, Jeff. Yes, please. Mute.
The third sentence seems to only apply to the second sentence. I mean, I'm not sure what we're telling agencies to put on the we're not saying they should indicate that on their first page or something like that.
Should that be built into the first sentence? Should clearly state their precedential status, or whether,
and whether they are modifying a previous precedent? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
But I think
don't know how you would.
in a digest, I think it should indicate that. But the report talks about using the sort of red flag thing that Westlaw uses.
Right.
But that's a little different point than the first sentence. So maybe we should break up number 9 into 2 parts. One in terms of the actual decision, and the other having to do with the digests and indexes.
So you would put a new recommendation for such.
After the first sentence is a recommendation, and then the
By
next,
itself.
yeah,
Yep.
yeah, something like that. But it might need a little bit of a.
Were you thinking that third sentence would stay in 9, or it would stay with 10?
10.
Yeah. So yeah.
But I think it.
There you go. And then restore.
You might need to sort of introduce the concept of a digest or an index, but maybe not. It's probably okay.
Adam?
For 9, would this apply to agencies that treat all of their appellate decisions as presidential? And sorry if I'm retreading some old ground here, but is this another example where it should say something like, for agencies that choose to treat only some or treat some but not all appellate decisions as presidential, then appellate decisions should clearly state their presidential status?
Any thoughts on that? I think it's meant to not be for agencies who, I mean, if all of your decisions, right, are presidential, I don't think you have to, right, indicate that. But I think you're right that we really mean just for where there's a split.
Right. Okay.
I think that was our intention too.
Yeah.
Which isn't to say the agency rules shouldn't address the matter, but on each decision, you're not going to stamp it precedential if everything's precedential.
It could almost lead to more confusion if that's the case.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, then maybe you could have a 9A and B. Right, make 10B. Because that would also only apply to Well, it applies to all of these, maybe. Let's see.
I think your best bet, even though it's duplicative, to maybe just keep it clean as a new one and repeat for agencies that choose to treat. I mean, it's odd to start a new thing with such agencies. It made sense when it was all one thing.
Yeah.
And here, because it is a good point to separate those, because the third sentence really does fit with the second. So you don't need to say agencies. For agencies that choose to, oh, no, you can, such agencies should. Now you also don't need to have also, because it's separate, right? Should indicate the Presidential Digest, should also clearly indicate when decisions have been overruled or modified.
Adam, did you have a follow-up? Is your hand still up from before? Okay.
No, sorry.
Let's totally fine. Let's go to Bill.
Well, I liked what's now 10 to be 9B, and then you can just say such agencies because it's referring to the agencies in main 9. But the last sentence of what is now 10 is all agencies, not just the agencies that have some decisions be precedential. That is, all agencies, even the agencies that have everything be precedential, should indicate when precedential decisions have been overruled or modified.
Where?
The last sentence of 10.
No, I mean, where's, I'm sorry, where should agencies indicate that? In the digest?
Maybe, but my only point is it's not part of 9 or 10. It's this whole separate idea because it's different agencies, all right? The first 9 and what was the beginning of 10 was only for agencies that do some precedential stuff. But what's now 11 has to be applies to all agencies. So that's why it needs to be separate. Now, let's talk about that later. We can still talk about 9 and 10, but
correct.
Separate.
Okay. Thank you. Lauren.
So what you want to do 9A and 9B then? Bill suggests. So, yeah.
So my comment, I think, sort of is related to that, and also to Nadine, your original statement related to on their face. And when you mentioned that, I was relieved. And now I think the rest of the conversation has taken me to a place of concern in terms of maintenance. So agreeing with the on their face piece, it seems like we're now saying that every single, like the decision itself on the PDF version or whatever there may be, that it says somehow we have indicated this is a precedent decision. So my concern is if an agency were to choose, say, not to just like put a stamp at the top, or even if they do, how we then indicate outside of the digests and the indexes themselves and on those PDF decisions that something is changed. Because for historical purposes, we would obviously want to be maintaining that had at some time been a precedent decision, but we would also want to then have clearly marked that it has been overruled or modified. So obviously, if something is overruled or modified, it has been precedent at some point. I know that all of us understand that. I am not sure the general public would understand the nuance of precedential status in a way that that's going to be sufficient for, I hesitate to use the word records or phrase records purposes, but that's the only one coming to mind. Put differently, knowing that our digests and indexes will properly indicate precedential status, which is actually something we're working on right now at EOIR, is making that clearer. Is it necessary that the decision itself be saying, I am a precedent decision? And if so, how to move that forward?
Jeff, do you have a thought on that?
Well, I mean, I think when the decision comes out, it should indicate that. And it seems like 9A and 9B shouldn't really give you much of a concern. It's really 10 now that you seem to be wondering how best to do that, because,
It's all of it together. Yeah.
but do you have a problem with 9A and B as it stands? Because
As a standalone, no, but once 10
Yeah.
comes into play, yes.
right, yeah, so it's 10 that's adding the problem.
Bill?
Yeah, you can't have 9A and B the way it is now, because right now it says all appellate decisions should indicate the precedential status of appellate decisions in digests. I mean, there's two concepts here. One, the decision itself should clearly state their precedential status. And that's one thing. Then there's a whole nother thing that says such agencies should also indicate the precedential status of appellate decisions in digest and index of cases that agencies make publicly available.
So it's not an AB, and it's really a 9, 10, and 11.
Well, I'd like keeping, if you're having, I'd make it 9 and 9A. I just make the second sentence 9A rather than, maybe you're not allowed to have just A's, right?
I know.
In which case, just make it a second sentence, but you can't have it this way because it doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make sense.
So
So let's go back. Yeah.
so semicolon.
I mean, I would say just make 10 the second sentence in 9 and say such agencies should also. Because that's only the agencies that have some appellate decisions. Such agencies should indicate the precedential status of appellate decision, blah, blah, blah.
Lauren, did you have a further point? Mhm.
Well, just following up. When we say we're indicating precedential status, do we mean we're only indicating when the decision is actually precedent, or are we saying you must mark every decision as precedential or non-precedential?
I read it as just marking a decision that's precedent as precedent.
So I don't think this is clear on that point. I defer to others, but to me,
That's a
it's
good point. That's a good
Yeah.
point.
that helps me a bit.
Such agency should also indicate. Shall identify.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of indicate.
Identify those precedential decisions in digest and indexes.
Well, what about the first sentence? Is it enough to say clearly state their precedential status, or clearly state
That they are precedential.
Or that a decision is precedential, maybe. That the decision is.
so they don't have to state that they're non-precedential?
Right.
And that resolves my problem, I think, with 10.
Mhm. Yeah, you can't then say all appellate decisions should clearly state
No.
that they're precedential, because they're not, right? But I do think well, I don't know that it's
should
so hard to, if you're really going to distinguish between precedential and not, to just clearly state the precedential status. An agency can decide the way you're going to identify that precedential status is we want you to say it on the ones that are, and people will understand the others or not, or we want you to stamp it yes or no. And I think that's word-wise just might be easier.
I would submit, however, that leaving the option of the agency to go beyond the recommendation and include indication of non-precedent is perhaps a cleaner way and gives the agencies a little more breathing room. Certainly that's where I would come from, than doing it in the opposite way.
So I'm not sure I understand the
So if the recommendation indicates that we should identify the precedential status, thereby implying we would say precedent, non-precedent, the recommendation would be difficult for some agencies perhaps to meet and maintain marking those non-precedential decisions. That's where I was coming from. Whereas if we recommend indicating precedent, and an agency wishes to take on the opposite, also marking non-precedent decisions, they could do that. There's nothing against the recommendation to take that extra step. but the recommendation is perhaps a little bit easier to consume by an agency, both already with a practice like us, and also by an agency without a practice in place.
I mean, that sounds fine. It seems to me that we should be able to get the words to say that. We just can't say then all appellate decisions, right? Should choose to treat only some as precedential,
Those decisions.
Those decisions should
Precedential.
clearly, well, I think you have to say something like choosing it. Decisions that are precedential should
Just say
clearly-
precedential decisions. All precedential decisions.
yes. Should clearly state the
Clearly
Oh.
state-
that
We
is-
have the appellate issue there, but
Why don't we start with the word agencies, take out 4 agencies that choose should clearly mark precedential decisions as such, or something like that.
yeah, this is a committee on style, I almost
Yeah,
feel.
Yeah.
it is, but
I would say identify, not mark. Again, I'm thinking about,
Mhm. Right, as such.
is it a stamp? Is it a, you know,
Mm-hmm. You're missing some words on line 62, 63. Agencies that choose to treat only some appellate decisions as precedential should omit. Oh, no,
Yeah,
no,
get
no,
rid
I'm
of
sorry.
one.
Should clearly identify, but no, it works. Sorry, I was just, yeah, it works.
anything further on this, Lauren? Does that capture your concern here?
so I think Lauren still has a question on number 10.
Yes.
Yeah,
I just
okay.
want to be sure we're good with 9. I'm not hearing anything, so hopefully we are. So I think Lauren's concern on 10 was the idea of it being possibly burdensome to take on.
Correct, Nadine, thank you. It was mostly in line with the idea of having marked a decision non-precedent and having to somehow figure out how to
Then,
remark and mark over, like this, I think works, especially, you're right, with the language of indicating instead of marking or anything like that, but there's a lot of variety in ways agencies could accomplish it. So I'm comfortable with this as drafted. Thank you.
What if it said agencies, digests and indexes should also clearly indicate?
That's even better.
Adam,
Oh, you already got rid of the also. I was gonna say, it's very stylistic, but to get rid of the also in the first sentence.
got it. Thank you. No, we take style edits, please.
Okay, but the way you have it have been overruled. Wait, I thought the second sentence was substituting for the
That's
first.
what I was trying to do.
Yeah,
think
I
we
think it
both-
substitutes for the first, and then you still need to take out the also. Yeah. Should clearly indicate, yep.
Because we're not suggesting that they go back and alter the first page of the old decision.
Any other thoughts on these? Jack,
Yeah, having number 10 only reference digest and indexes is concerning to me, because you would think in the decision that when they were overruling, when they should also do that, although they have to anyway, but I'm not sure that I'm not sure that I'm not sure that it mandates a particular form of indication, the first sentence anyway. So in other words, the fear is that it means you have to put it on the first page, but that doesn't say that. So I don't seems to me that there ought to be a general requirement that when you're overruling a decision, you say so clearly.
We've already said that in one of the earlier recommendations.
What is it? What does that one say? Can we go back to that and see that if it says?
That's the
same
one
thing?
just above,
Just
right?
above. Yeah,
Yep, on 8.
number 8.
But that's happening in the decision itself, right?
Yeah, yes.
So I guess I'm reading 10 as something a little different, but welcome thoughts on what's meant here.
So personally, for Eeyore, I'm fine with either of the sentences in 10, either the struck or the new. I do think that, you know, my larger point for the broader audience is, again, just the maintenance of the public facing record piece. You know, we don't want to be in the business of going back and modifying the decision that was already posted as precedent by going in and stamping it somehow or anything of that nature. There are certainly ways, again, that we're working on now of better marking things overruled and modified in our digestment indexes, not the decisions themselves. I would very much be interested in hearing ways that we could maintain the original decision with its original precedent mark, some, you know, in an archive or however it would be, while also then maintaining one that shows it has been overruled or modified, so as not to alter the original decision and the integrity of that document. That said, the way that our websites work, of course, is if someone does a Google search and searches a precedent decision and they find the marked precedent decision in your archive without some sort of alteration to that document, they're going to assume precedent.
Unless they check Westlaw. I mean.
Well, and for an attorney or someone else with access to Westlaw, that's reasonable.
Right.
But, you know, we deal with people obviously who are even of limited English proficiency. So thinking about the public consumption of it is where I was coming from.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which agency are you with, Lauren? Sorry.
It's okay. The Justice Department's Executive Office for Immigration Review,
Oh, okay.
Immigration Courts,
Okay.
and the BIA.
So where does that leave us on 10? I mean, you know, we have 8, which makes it clear that in the decision that's doing the overruling, right, it's going to identify what it's overruling. And then the question is, how do you reflect that?
Website copies. Website references.
Bill?
I would, we have here in 10 a should do something. Perhaps we should have a should consider doing what Lauren is suggesting. You know, it may be possible for some agencies to be able to go back and put a big X on the original decision that was overruled in its file in some way. But, you know, that's going to be agency specific, to say the least. I'd put it second. I'd have the agency digest clearly indicate, and an agency should consider the possibility of reflecting the overruled status of the previous decision or previous decisions.
Hi, I see your hand up and I'm going to go to Jeremy because I have a feeling he has an idea. Ah, he did. Where did he go?
I did it. You think after how many years now? Not an idea specifically, but I did want to call to the committee's attention. It's not quite parallel, but it might provide either a useful model or something else to consider. ACUS obviously recently adopted a recommendation last year on the public availability of inoperative guidance. In a sense, we're talking about inoperative precedential decisions. There may be things in that recommendation that are relevant here.
Thank you. Hi.
Yeah, number one, again, considering implementation, I don't like the piece of saying should consider, because the whole thing is they're considering, okay, all of this. And I do think that I like it as sort of like Lauren, I can do either the sentence that's been deleted, although I think I have a preference for just the second sentence. This is about the availability. Agencies digest and index should clearly indicate when precedential decisions have been overruled or modified, period. I mean, a lot of agencies don't do digests and indexes. I mean, EOC doesn't, it's, and if you're Googling, hopefully you'll also get the second decision, which, as 8 already says, has to expressly overrule. That's what's really important. So I really, I would just go with the current first sentence that we have on 10 and leave it at that.
Any other thoughts if we take that out and leave 10 to focus on digests and indices, indexes?
How about websites?
Where else would the digest or index be?
Might be in a paid for digest, like the I forget the names of them, but they were referenced in the report. There were some that you had to subscribe to.
Those are private ones?
Private ones, yeah.
Well, if they're private, then the agency can't assure that.
Absolutely.
Well, they can,
That is true.
they can provide the information to the.
Well, it's an agency's digest based on the way, as opposed to someone else's, the way it's been. I think it's fine to add websites. I mean, here's the thing. There's not going to be thousands and thousands, of opinions that are going to be overruled.
It might not be in a digest. You might Google it on the agent, search for it on the agency website.
Yeah, EOC's federal sector decisions, every single one of them is on the website. So if you've actually overruled a decision, and I think it is good practice to say, go back to the website where that initial decision is listed and put that little red flag. This has been overruled by, and you have the new decision and the link to it. So I don't think this is overly burdensome, and I do think it's good policy.
Any other thoughts on 10 as it stands? All right, let's move on to 11. I think there's a wordsmithing here from Jack. I think it's fine. 12. I was curious about the and. So agencies should do all of these things? Summaries, a digest, and an index?
Should consider.
Can I go back to 11 for a second? Because
Okay, yep.
required to follow them. I mean, agency heads aren't required to follow previous decisions. It's, they're stare decisis. They don't have to follow them. So, I mean, why don't we just say to their adjudicators? Right, Jack? They're not really required to follow them.
Yeah, well, follow them is better than upon whom they're binding in regard to what you're saying. But yeah, I thought this, I read this as being not about the agency heads, but about the lower level adjudicators. But so that's why
we could say that.
Well, Jeff, your suggestion does. I like that.
Okay.
Make sure these presidential decisions are effectively communicated to their adjudicators, period.
I feel like we've said that in another recommendation, but I leave that to the staff to know for sure.
I don't think we did.
So 11, we're set with 11. Move to 12. My question was whether and is what's really intended there. Most agencies post their decisions, just period, post their decisions. And
Isn't it required under section 552?
to post on the website a summary and a digest and an index,
An index anyway.
an index. Hi,
Well, here I was gonna say, I like the and here is something where I like consider, because not all of them are gonna be able to do this, but I actually think all three things are good. Again, EOC will do every single opinion and not differentiate. If they choose to now adopt this recommendation and do precedential, I think it's nice if they would actually do a summary and a digest and an index, but the agency will do it based on its resources. So Nadine, to your question, I think and is fine here, so long as the consider.
I was thinking of implementation and how it could sometimes be difficult to agree on the summary or a digest. I tend to hear from some of my colleagues, the decision speaks for itself. So the minute you start trying to summarize it or digest it within the agency, it becomes an interesting exercise. Bill.
Well, I think having and doesn't eliminate the ability to eliminate one of those. They should consider them all, but they don't necessarily have to do them all. They might only do one or two, but I think and is the right connector for that.
Okay.
I just want to point out what 552 says. So it says a final order, opinion, statement of policy, interpretation, or staff manual, a final order, opinion that affects a member of the public may be relied on, used, or cited as precedent by an agency against a party only if it has been indexed and either made available or published as provided by this paragraph. So 552 already requires, I don't know how, if it's being followed by all the agencies. I think an earlier, that 1989 study that ACUS did found that there was a lot of non-compliance by agencies with that 552 provision, but I think it's already required. So the indexing part.
Not a topical index though, so it doesn't have to be a useful index. It could just be a horribly long laundry list of cases. So that was why index was included here to consider, but your point is taken.
Which can now be searched with Control F. That horribly long list. Yeah, I do we need to rephrase that, Jeff, you think, to
well, I mean, they should do more than considering. I mean,
should it say in addition to indexing,
well,
agencies should consider? Maybe
the preamble can just reiterate what the legal requirement is and then take care of Jeremy's point by saying this is how it should be organized topically.
Jeff, the 552 doesn't say it has to be on their website, does it?
Well, I bet it doesn't.
Well, I mean, I think it used to have to only be in the reading room, but I think now that's been changed. It starts off, each agency shall make available for public inspection in an electronic format. So doesn't that mean website?
Mm-hmm. But I think Nadine's suggestion is correct here, that I don't know if people are actually doing the indexes or not, but I think it's good to have the preamble make clear what they're already supposed to be doing under 552.
Yeah.
Again, I think a lot of them are. They just post everything maybe on a website. That's, again, it's only what EOC does. But this is a different recommendation, right? It is an index organized topically. And maybe if it's okay within the agency to do summaries or digests, then it'll also be that.
I'm just thinking implementation, that's all.
Well, exactly, which is why here consider makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Here it makes sense to me.
Yeah. Okay. 13. 14.
It's nice to see effected spelled correctly in this recommendation.
Yeah. 14, we have some edits from Jack. So this is about tracking subsequent history. This gave me pause, I will say, thinking of the burden on an agency like mine to essentially try to duplicate what commercial databases already do and try to ensure its accuracy. I envision a disclaimer that litigants should not rely solely on some sort of, like, for their site checking purposes, that we are now not shepherds. But back to what is proposed from Jack.
I mean, I hope this is self-explanatory. That I just felt like the last sentence hung there as a non-recommending sentence. So this puts the whole thing, it doesn't change anything of substance, I don't think. It just makes it a one single unified recommendation.
And again, it should consider, it's not should
Yes.
do.
Absolutely. All these recommendations are always subject to agency resources and abilities. Anything on 14? The only other question, I guess, is should consider tracking subsequent history. And is this on their webs? Is it understood that we mean on their websites, on their digests? Are we tracking this internally? I mean, obviously it's public facing, the idea. Do we need to say anything like that? Like where, how?
Well, it's in the availability section. So
Should be understood.
the heading, I mean.
Yeah, it's not completely understood though. It's sort of more that should consider doing this, which again is a resource thing, and, second sense, if the agency does engage in this, in such tracking, to make that available, to make that information available. But I just want to say, I really think that's a resource issue.
Lauren.
With apologies, I was circling back, but just as a note for the comment, when looking at the preamble language related to the indices, it doesn't appear, unless I'm really missing something, that the index in 552 is actually for the decisions of the agency. It appears that that's more related to the copies of records, and I don't think that it's intended to include agency decisions. I could be very wrong, but that's, I think, how we've always interpreted it anyway.
Well, it says shall make available final opinions, including concurring and dissenting opinions, as well as orders made in the adjudication of cases.
Right, but the index piece, I believe, in 2E refers only to paragraph D and is just about copies of all records that have been released under paragraph 3 or because of the nature of their subject matter determined to be future releases.
But keep reading. After that, a final order or opinion may not be cited as precedent, or may be cited as precedent only if it has been indexed.
So, yeah, I mean, this, like I said, this is a note for the comment. I mean, the way that we were talking about the summaries and pieces of precedential decisions being organized topically, it seems to me that, let's see, or cited, oh, I see what you mean, because if it's cited as precedent by an agency.
It can only be cited as precedent against a party if it has been indexed and made available or published as provided by this paragraph.
Yeah, I guess it's the against the party other than an agency piece that makes me think it's not I mean, what's the point in precedent if it can't be used for that, right? But
I mean, you're right in that it's not an affirmative requirement, but it's kind of there's a sanction if you don't do it.
no, I agree with everything you're saying. So yeah, like I said, I don't think it changes the language, but I wanted to note it for purposes of the comment when evaluated for the preamble.
Yeah.
Sorry to make us go backwards.
It's totally fine. So, were you suggesting another sentence in 14? Was that your thought or no?
That was my thought, but the truth is, I don't think it's essential. I think if an agency does it, they probably will on their own put it on their website.
So look at the opening part of this.
Is
Exactly what the whole thing is about, which is availability.
Adam?
Well, I was just going to point out that the sentence that was struck did have this language, such tracking if made available to agency officials and the public. Was that intended to be struck as a substantive matter, or is that just stylistic? Because if the latter, then you could probably just take that clause and put it in the first sentence where you're saying to enable parties, blah, 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 agencies should consider tracking on their own or in coordination with commercial databases, comma, and make available to agency officials and the public, comma, the subsequent history of presidential opinions. So it's kind of a question and a comment.
So I think the last sentence was struck, was proposed to be struck because it does not make a recommendation. So it's something that might be typically included in a preamble. But I see your point about trying to build it into the first sentence to make it clear that what you do with it once you track it. Lauren?
Is this not number 10?
It used to be, maybe. Oh,
I feel like, yeah, I feel like we're getting stuck in these words, but it may be that we've already done what this is intended to do with number 10.
No,
Unless
this
we're
I think
talking about,
looks
like, a
at, I
full-fledged
think,
history.
I guess I read 10 and it's not clear as if the agency itself has overruled or modified its own decisions.
I
But
think she
that,
means 12. I think she means 12.
oh,
No, I mean
sorry.
10. No, I mean 10.
The new 12.
Nope,
Nope,
the new
10.
10.
Yeah.
Yeah, because we're saying, and it's not clear, and if we did mean that the agencies have overruled themselves, then that's different, and probably we should look at 10 again, but it seems to me like I was imagining when a federal court overrules one of our appellate body BIA decisions, that it would be marked such on our website digest and indices. And that seems, we would obviously be somewhat tracking that using Westlaw, Lexis, et cetera, information from our litigators, and that's really what we're trying to do in 14.
No, I see what you're saying. I read it that I just put those words in there. That 10 was about the agencies, what they're doing with their own, and then 14 is about if a court overrules you. Subsequent history, right, from outside the agency, is how I was reading it.
Like when Shepard's tells us something.
I think her point makes me think that 12 and 14 could somehow be combined.
Yeah. Hi, saying no.
No, because I think part of this is a problem because we've separated it out, but here's all the shoulds, okay? So I think 10, I had read it just when the agency overruled itself.
Right.
Right?
That's
Because
how I
remember
read
that had all been, just as Nadine said, but I think now that you made this point, we should make that clear. So should clearly indicate if it has overruled a precedential decision.
I think we have to say the agency. I don't think we can say
But
it.
the agency, right, if the
Yeah.
agency has overruled, should clear if the agency has overruled a precedential decision, yes, take that out. And then we have.
Overruled or
third-
modified.
Yeah, has overruled or modified a presidential decision. Okay, then take out the rest. And then we've got, they should do this, then and then they should update the manuals. And then they should consider posting, actually probably 12 and 13 should be flipped because here are all the shoulds, communicated, update your manuals. And by the way, no one's going to end up doing that, but it is a should. And then consider posting on your website the brief summaries. And 14, and I think Adam made that really good point that Jack, you were just trying to do wordsmithing, but it actually missed this piece. So the way that sentence now reads is it captures that. To enable them, that might be missed, should consider tracking on their own and make available the subsequent history. And here I think it is more clear that it's a subsequent history outside of the agency.
Mhm.
Can I chime in?
Why
on
Yeah.
this? It could also be modified by statute, or superseded by an agency regulation. And so there's much more, the tracking involves much more than just federal court remand. And then on line 84 here, the agency, the new number 10, I guess it is, takes care of the part about agency in another case. So if we're talking only about external, then the subsequent, including whether the case was remanded by a federal court or remanded or overturned by a federal court, right? Remanded, overturned, or modified by a federal court, or superseded by statute or other agency action, such as a rule, something like that. That's what this is getting at, right? That the precedential status of the rule, of the decision, might be affected by something outside the agency.
I want to suggest, just for the next draft, I would just be careful when talking about the disposition that a federal court can make of an agency decision. I don't know that federal courts overturn agency decisions, do they?
Well, if an agency is found to be no substantial evidence for
I know, but
adjudication,
the only question is just a technical question: is overturn the right phrase to use there?
Reversed.
You mean like vacated and set
Rejected?
aside or something?
Yeah, I mean,
Reversed.
yeah.
Set
I just-
aside,
I think-
set aside, set
Set
I
aside.
think we should, set aside.
Yeah, set aside, that's
Might
good.
as well use the 706 language here.
yeah.
Okay, how do we think that looks? So the distinction now, we've made it clear above that it's agencies and this is external.
Exactly.
Put them both on the same screen somehow.
So,
Maybe get rid of this
Probably not.
11, get rid
yeah.
of the 11, the screen.
I don't think it's possible, and I think it's easy enough the way it's done for us to read.
Okay.
10 is the agency has done it, and then I really like your edits below that take out the agency one and puts in these other possibilities.
Okay,
I
No,
just,
too-
I do want to point out that I made the edit as minimal as possible, but I'm not sure that it's typical for us to have that to enables language in a recommendation. I mean, that still is somewhat preamble language. All the other ones, it's implicit why we're recommending it. I have nothing against it, but it does stick out a little bit as different language,
I agree.
but it's up to the group. I don't feel strongly because I think maybe this one would be a little more difficult for people to understand what we're talking about. I don't know.
I agree that this is something for the preamble. Anytime we say should consider, the preamble should make the case as to why we are recommending, especially something that's going to seem like a heavy lift. So
Yes.
I'm with you on just taking that out of the recommendation.
That was his own language. He's amending his own language.
Yes.
Can I
Great.
just say something on the preamble? It wouldn't be customary. I mean, we need to this needs to be discussed with the staff, but I've heard some discussion about this is going to be addressed in the preamble and that in the preamble. The preamble is not going to have that level of granularity on some of these points. I just want to sort of note that. That's not how ACUS drafts stuff normally.
Well, I'd like to suggest that we really think about that in terms of what might make sense to put in a preamble. because people aren't going to be reading the report necessarily. And I think, I mean, this might be a bigger conversation, but I think this discussion indicates why maybe we do want some of this stuff in the preamble. I think it's a good point you've raised. But I think it's something to think about.
There's also the sort of countervailing consideration, which you sometimes hear from ACUS members and a few members of the council. I've heard this before, is that if something really needs to be called to the attention of an agency official, it should be in the recommendation. Just a countervailing consideration, but this is something for really the staff and to discuss, I think, in terms of the approach.
Well, another thing
Bill?
is we only put footnotes in the preamble now. So if we want to reference some statutory provision like 552, that's one way to do it in the preamble. We have this kind of new policy of avoiding footnotes in the recommendation itself.
Bill?
Go ahead.
I just want to say, I don't know why you need to say anything in the preamble about this particular provision, because it's pretty obvious. If you're saying to make it available to agency officials and the public, that makes clear why you're doing it. I don't think you need anything in the preamble to justify that.
Jeremy, was that you?
That's what I was going to say. I think we can have a simple statement. Here's what FOIA requires. Here's other options to make things. The important thing is to make these things not only available in an accessible way, and the recommendation goes into it. And I think the prefatory language that was just struck could, as Bill said, apply to any of these here, not just 14. So that should be easy to handle.
Okay, we have just a few more minutes left, and we have one more. I forget how, oh, we have more. Well, let's get started on 15 and we'll see how far we get. I don't want to keep you past 4 on a Friday afternoon. Anything in 15? Jack has some edits to C and D, recommending that we not distinguish between, I guess the idea is calling out kind of this hybrid approach where you have some and not all.
My point here was I didn't understand why these would only apply in a some situation, not in an all situation, but I could be corrected on that.
I had exactly the same problem.
Jeff, did you have something? No.
Only that we might have added a few things to this recommendation that aren't reflected on this list now that maybe should also be in the Federal Register and CFR. So you might want to take another look.
Staff can look at that. Yeah. For us to consider next time. Okay. Anything else on the list? Might get longer. Bill, did you have something further?
Yeah, and I think this is another point that Jack made, that subsection F, subsection G is, I think, I don't see how it's different from C.
G and C, let me just make sure I'm following here. Can we see G? I know we can't see them both at the same time, I don't think.
Well, it's actually on the screen.
They should both be on the screen.
Oh, they are. Oh, it's struck. It's because it's struck. Sorry, I was skipping.
Jack also noted that, and so he suggested we delete G, or he might have just pointed it out to me, and I suggested we delete G to resolve that issue. That came about when we were trying to add in overruling sort of toward the end of drafting, and I put it in a couple different places and then
forgot to take it out. Yeah.
Forgot to take out one of the options.
Yep.
So
okay. So G is out, Bill.
Okay. And we dealt with H already, right? We took that out as well. Because we put that up front under a separate provision dealing with non-precedential decisions.
Yeah.
Yes.
So H, or what's now G, should be
G.
So,
Yeah, because that has moved up to the new subsection that we have on use of non-precedential.
Right.
Hi,
Yeah, but I think this is where I was thinking repetition might be okay. Can you just scroll up to the top here? I mean, you may not need it, but as part of their rules of practice, we didn't say up there that it should be in their rules of practice. We were just saying, hey, they can cite it and you should think about it. I think that repetition may be worth it here. Okay, now here's your checklist. Also put in that piece that you've figured out about how you're going to consider them. So I understand it's somewhat repetitive, but I don't think completely, because this is about what should actually be in the rule. I mean, if you scroll up to where we had it before, I think it's pretty clear. It's just saying, hey, guys, figure out how you want to consider it, right? Explain when and for what purposes and how the agency, it doesn't say where you're going to then publish your explanation or whatever. So maybe here it's should clarify when and for what purpose and how the agency, oh, no, but okay. Maybe we don't need that explain. Because that looks like it's been added, right? Oh, because you repeated it from here. I think we don't need to repeat it in that A. It's where we don't have an A. This is, maybe it's, but should determine when and for what purposes a party may cite, right? So this is just, no.
no,
on
it's
line
in
34.
3,
It's in 3 ready, just on line 34.
34.
Instead of saying clarified, say determine, okay? You got to figure out when and for what purposes a party may cite and how the agency will consider it, okay? Then take out all of A, because
And
that's
leave it
about
in.
explaining it, and then you leave it as whatever it is, H or whatever it is below, or G. Yep.
Any thoughts on that? Okay. Down to the last 2 and we have 2 minutes. Can we do it?
Yeah.
Clear and consistent terminology, we can't argue over that. Of course we want that.
And this indeed is a problem, so on this one.
Anything on 16 and 17? Bill?
I didn't like new in 17 when adopting procedural regulations. I wasn't taking out or materially amending, just
Right.
just a new when adopting
Or
materially
material.
amending.
Just new.
I mean, it probably should be when adopting procedural regulations or materially amending existing procedural regulations. It's just,
Yes. Excellent. Hi, did you have anything further on these? No? Okay. All right. I think we'll call it a day then, with a minute to spare.
when would the cost clearly outweigh the benefits?
This may be, Jeremy, is this sort of, I don't know, I don't want to call it stock language, but this, it sounds like it appeared elsewhere in recent recommendations.
I think we can take out the last clause there.
I disagree. I
Yeah.
mean, materially amending, I don't know what, I just, if you just amend it, how material does it have to be to go through notice and comment? I mean, notice and comment just makes so much more time and effort to something. I don't see why.
It's definitely costs.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you should leave it in.
Okay, I recede.
Okay, we're gonna call it a day. We're gonna meet again Friday afternoon, November 4th. I hope you can all be there. The recommendation